No matter what a team has to go through or what's ahead of them, winning a World Series is not an easy thing to do. Whether a team has an easy path or a difficult one, every championship counts the same. But with that said, let's try to find out which teams had the most difficult path to a World Series.
Totally sports-esque. Major League.
In comparing the championship-winning teams, we'll be looking at their playoff opponents' wins and their team wins above average. This advanced stat measures how effective a player is in comparison to the average Major League player. With Baseball Reference, we can see the average wins above average for each position on the team, and unsurprisingly, the better teams are always near the top of these lists. So these two stats can go a long way in determining the level of competition. And since the MLB's playoff format has changed many times throughout the years, we'll be looking at different eras for comparison. And we'll start with the LCS era. Starting in 1969, the NLCS and ALCS were added as league expanded and relocated. For this, whoever was the best team in the American League and whoever was the best team in the National League faced off in the World Series. Which makes you wonder how different things would be if teams in this period had to face multiple teams to win it all, and if teams after this period would just have to face one. For reference, here's what the last 10 World Series would be if the top team in each league played each other in the World Series. Only one of these series ended up actually happening, and obviously, we know everything would be completely different. So anyway, let's look at the LCS era ranging from 1969 to 1993. Before we start, we should note that we won't include the Dodgers' 1981 World Series. If you didn't know, that season was shortened to 109 games due to a strike, and the playoffs were expanded to 8 teams to include the teams in first place in each half of the season. So in this sense, it's hard to compare the 1981 Dodgers playoff run to others. So let's look at the 12 champions before the 1981 Dodgers. In terms of opponent wins, leading the way is the first team to ever beat multiple teams in the playoffs, and that's the 1969 Mets. This team was nicknamed the Miracle Mets for a reason, as this was the first time in their short history that they had a winning season. And in the playoffs, they swept the 93-win Braves in the NLCS, then beat the 109-win Orioles in the World Series in 5 games. The Orioles' 109 wins were the third highest in American League history to that point. And with the Orioles winning their second pennant in 4 years and being considered one of the greatest teams of all time, it was a massive upset when the Mets came out on top. And aside from the Mets, the only other championship teams in this time with opponent win totals over 200 were the 1970 Baltimore Orioles and the 1977 New York Yankees. The Orioles won their second of 3 straight pennants in 1970 and swept the 98-win Twins in the ALCS, then beat the 102-win Reds in the World Series. And in 1977, the Yankees won a decisive Game 5 against the 102-win Royals, then beat the 98-win Dodgers in 6 games, where Reggie Jackson became the second player to hit 3 home runs in a World Series game. And in this time, the lowest playoff opponent win totals both belonged to the Oakland Athletics. The first 2 of 3 straight World Series from 1972 to 1974 were the lowest, with their 73 title being the lowest. And this is in part thanks to the 1973 Mets having the lowest win total amongst pennant-winning teams in MLB history at 82. And when we move to the wins above average stat, the 1969 Mets don't lead this category, as that actually belongs to the 1977 Yankees. Adding up the Royals and Dodgers wins above average totals equals 34.9, just ahead of the 1976 Reds and almost 3 points ahead of the 1969 Mets. And though the top changed in this stat, the bottom did not, as the 72 and 73 A's opponents remain at the bottom by a pretty wide margin, as the 1980 Phillies opponents are the only other to total under 20. And when we add these two stats up, at the top is the 1977 Yankees just edging out the 1969 Mets, while the 72 and 73 A's are the only two not to break 200. So as we see, the 2 easiest and hardest runs in this sense are pretty clear cut. But before choosing one, let's look at the rest of the LCS era from 1982 to 1993. The highest opponent win total in this time belongs to the 1988 Dodgers. This Dodger team was the only one in this time to beat 2 100-win opponents, after beating the 100-win Mets in 7 games and beating the 104-win Athletics in 5 games, thanks in part to Kirk Gibson's iconic walk-off home run in Game 1. Their opponent win total equaled 204, and only one other team's opponent in this time reached the 200 mark, and that was the 1985 Royals, who beat the 99-win Blue Jays in the ALCS. and the 101-win Cardinals in the World Series, both times in 7 games. And at the bottom of this list is the 1984 Tigers, who take the last spot by a fairly wide margin, after sweeping the 84-win Royals in the ALCS and beating the 92-win Padres in the World Series in 5 games. And when we look at the 1984 standings, we can see it was a strange year, as the Tigers were the only team in the American League to win over 90 games. So this was a case of the Tigers being by far and away the best team. And this gets backed up much further by looking at the wins above average stat. While their opponent win total was an outlier, the wins above average being at just 2.5 is a massive outlier, as the second lowest with the 1983 Orioles is 9.2 points ahead, and well behind, to say the least, the 1988 Dodgers opponents totaling 37.3, with the 1985 Royals opponents being the only others to total over 30. And when we add these two stats, unsurprisingly, the 1988 Dodgers top the list, with the 1985 Royals behind, and ahead of the 1990 Cincinnati Reds at third by a pretty wide margin. So just like the first 12, the two most difficult in this sense are pretty clear cut, while the easiest path here is very obvious. And we can easily say the 1984 Tigers had the easiest path to the World Series in the LCS era, but that's nothing to take away from them. When you're the best team in the league, you get rewarded by playing the weaker competition, and in 1984, any team was weaker competition for the Tigers. So to quote a guy who probably has an addiction to online poker, you have to work with the hand you're dealt. And in the LCS era, in my opinion, the team that did the best with the hand they were dealt was the 1988 Dodgers, both statistically and with what they had to overcome. The Dodgers were huge underdogs in the LCS against the Mets, which they won in 7, and they were underdogs in main part because they lost 10 out of 11 in the regular season against the Mets. And in the World Series, they were once again massive underdogs going against the stacked Oakland A's team. And it can't be overstated how massive Kirk Gibson's walk-off home run in Game 1 was. That single play added 27.3% to the Dodgers' championship win probability, by far the highest percent added for a single play in a Game 1. And in the highest total between the two stats in the LCS era, we have a tie between the 1977 Yankees and 1985 Royals, with the 69 Mets right behind. And the reason the 1985 Royals had the most impressive run of these three is once again what they had to overcome. While the Royals weren't massive underdogs in the ALCS, they still had to overcome a 3-1 deficit. And in the World Series, they were massive underdogs against the Cardinals. And what's incredible here is in the World Series, they overcame a 3-1 deficit again. Cardinal fans will remind you about the blown call in Game 6, but nonetheless, the 1985 Royals rank second here in my opinion, both statistically and for what they had to overcome. So after taking a look at all the championship teams in the LCS era, let's move on to the LDS era ranging from 1995 to 2011. After the strike in 1994 that canceled the playoffs expanded to include 8 teams. And before we start, it should be noted that only 144 games were played in 1995 due to the strike, which isn't massive, but has a bit of an impact on the stats here, which is something to keep in mind for the 1995 Braves. So let's look at these 17 World Series winning teams. Leading the way in terms of opponent wins is the 2004 Red Sox. In that year, the Red Sox swept the 92-win Angels in the ALDS, and just like the 1988 Dodgers, they beat 2 100-win opponents in the LCS and World Series. In the ALCS, they beat the rivals, the 101-win New York Yankees, after coming back from a 3-0 deficit. Then, in the World Series, they swept the 105-win Cardinals to break the curse of the Bambino. Just like the LCS era, there isn't a wide gap between the top couple spots. The 2011 Cardinals finished in second at 294 opponent wins, while the 1999 Yankees and 2002 Angels opponents were the only others to top 290, with both finishing at 292. At the bottom of the list is the 1995 Braves opponents, but as mentioned, there's an asterisk here, so besides them, the lowest opponent win total belongs to the 2006 Cardinals. And what's interesting here is that the 2006 Cardinals are the worst team to ever win the World Series in terms of record. And looking at the 2006 standings, with only one team finishing over 95 wins, the win total was going to be low no matter what. And while the 2006 Cardinals opponents have the lowest win total, they aren't anywhere close to the lowest wins above average total. That title belongs to the opponents of the 2009 Yankees. And it's not even close, as the 19.8 average is the only total to finish under 23.2, which also belongs to Yankees opponents, this time being in the year 2000. And when we move to the top of the list, there's an even wider gap between the top two spots, with the 2011 Cardinals opponents finishing first at 51.6, followed by the 2002 Angels at 45.4. And looking at the opponents of the 2011 Cardinals, the Cardinals beat the top two in the league in this stat, and the other team they beat, the Milwaukee Brewers, finished 6th. So it's not surprising to see them at the top. But what is interesting is that despite not playing a full season, the 1995 Braves finished tied for 3rd with the 99 Yankees opponents. So we can only wonder how things would have ended up if they played just 18 more games. And an interesting thing to consider in a what-if situation is that if the Yankees would have won Game 7 of the 2001 World Series, they would have had the highest opponent win total and wins above average by a very wide margin. After facing the top 3 in this stat, that includes the 2001 Mariners, who tied an MLB record by winning 116 games that year, but they didn't win the World Series. And the 2001 Diamondbacks opponents had a wins above average total almost 40 points lower, just proving how unfair baseball is. And in the LCS era, when we add the win total and wins above average, the leader is the 2011 Cardinals, totaling 345.6. And the top 3 is the same as the top 3 in the wins above average total. And here's a stat Yankee haters will love, then be disappointed when it doesn't change anything, as the bottom 3 of this list consists of just the Yankees, with the 95 Braves just ahead of them. As was the case with the 1984 Tigers, the Yankees were the best team in the league in 2 of these 3 years. So they were rewarded with weaker competition, and that includes the 1998 season where they avoided the 106-win Atlanta Braves, though I doubt it would matter, as that 98 Yankees team was arguably the greatest team ever. And statistically, they had the second easiest run behind the 2009 Yankees, but different to the LCS era, the easiest run wasn't as obvious. And on the other side, in my opinion, the toughest run to a World Series in the LDS era belongs to the 2011 Cardinals, both statistically and for what they overcame. They were underdogs in every series, and none more than in the NLDS against the 102-win Phillies, who they beat in 5 games. They then beat the winners of their own division, the Brewers, in the NLCS in 6 games, then topped it off by winning one of the wildest games in history in Game 6 of the World Series. The Cardinals had multiple Kirk Gibson moments in this game, but statistically none were more important than David Free's game-tying triple in the bottom of the 9th, adding 29% to the Cardinals' championship win probability, the second highest in a Game 6, behind Joe Carter's walk-off home run in Game 6 of the 1993 World Series. And you can watch my most recent video about the final day of the 2011 regular season that makes their championship even more unbelievable, in a day that led to our next era, the wildcard era. After the 2011 season that brought us 2 incredible late-season comebacks for wildcard spots with the Cardinals and Rays, the MLB expanded the playoffs to include the wildcard game featuring the top 2 wildcard teams. This was by far the shortest era of any playoff format in MLB history, with the MLB expanding to 12 teams in 2022. But we will include the 2022 Astros in this era, but not the 2020 Dodgers. And it's not because I think their World Series doesn't count, it's just once again, the very low amount of games makes it hard to compare to other championship winning teams. So first, looking at the highest opponent win total, by the widest margin this far, that distinction belongs to the 2019 Nationals. Including the wildcard game, the total equals 393, 30 more wins than the 2014 Giants opponents, who are the only other wildcard team to win the World Series in this era. But even if we take away the wins from their wildcard opponents, the 2019 Nationals opponents still lead by 8, ahead of the 2021 Braves, who faced 3 95-plus win opponents. And at the bottom of this list is the 2015 Royals opponents, which is actually the lowest of any non-wildcard team since 1996. In that year, the Royals faced 3 opponents with less than 94 wins. But as is the case with many top teams in the league, including the 2016 Cubs, they face weaker competition, and perhaps are fortunate to face lesser teams deeper in the playoffs. And just like the LDS era, the team at the bottom in opponent win totals is not at the bottom in opponent wins above average, as that distinction belongs to the 2016 Cubs, as the toughest opponent in this sense was the team they played in the first round with the wildcard San Francisco Giants. And what's really interesting here is when you take away the 2014 Pittsburgh Pirates that the Giants beat in the wildcard game, the 2014 Giants opponents then take the top spot, thanks in main part to the 2014 Cardinals having a low total and the 2014 World Series being the only World Series to feature the two wildcard game winning teams. And on top of this list is the same as the highest opponent win total with the 2019 Nationals, with their opponents totaling 61.9. And that does include the Brewers, who they beat in the wildcard game, but the Brewers only totaled 1.4 wins above average, so they barely made a difference. And even if we included just the teams they beat in the NLDS and World Series with the Dodgers and Astros, that would put them second, as that would total 50.9. A little over 5 less than the 2018 Red Sox, whose run shouldn't be understated here. They defeated 3 of the top 5 in this stat, and the Red Sox themselves were one of the top 5. Despite the possible accusations, this 2018 Red Sox team is one of the greatest ever in my opinion, and most overall top seeds have an easy path as a reward. This 2018 team did not, and in every series, their opponents didn't win more than one game, so they dominated the regular and postseason like few teams have. And when we add up both of these stats, starting at the bottom and last is the 2016 Cubs opponents, with the 2015 Royals opponents not too far behind, and without the wildcard game, the 2014 Giants are right behind them. Just like the LDS era, there isn't an obvious choice for the easiest run, and the statistical gap is much closer here. But if we narrow down these two candidates of the 2015 Royals and 2016 Cubs, it's easier to point towards the 2015 Royals as having the easier run, in the sense of the Cubs having to overcome a 3-1 deficit and a curse placed by a GOAT, both brought upon by themselves. But it's easy to go either way here. And as said many times, even the easiest runs to the World Series, especially in this era, aren't easy. And when we move on to the top of the list, just like the 1988 Dodgers, the 2019 Nationals lead in every one of these 3 stats. With the wildcard game, their opponents' combined total is 454.9, almost 60 points more than the 2014 Giants, including the wildcard game. And even when we take away the 2019 Nationals wildcard opponent, they are still in first place by 13 points, by far the widest gap in any era. And that gap is against the 2018 Red Sox, who are ahead of the best team in the LDS era, the 2011 Cardinals, by 5.5 points. So with all this said, I think it's safe to say that the 2019 Nationals had the toughest run to a World Series in not just the wildcard era, but also all of MLB history. Looking back at their run, though it started with their easiest opponent by far, the wildcard game was never an easy win with how unpredictable baseball is. And in that game, the Nationals trailed 3-1 in the 8th inning and scored 3 runs in that inning off the best reliever in the league, Josh Hader. Then in the NLDS, they were down 2-1 against the Dodgers, who that year set a franchise record with 106 wins. And in Game 5, they were once again down 3-1 in the 8th before they tied the game with back-to-back home runs off Clayton Kershaw before winning in extra innings. They would end up dominating the Cardinals in the NLCS with a sweep, and what is the most impressive part of the entire Nationals run is what they did in that World Series, despite all the controversies after, with the fact that the 2019 Astros supposedly did not cheat that year. That 2019 Astros team will go down as one of the greatest teams ever, and maybe the best to not win it all. The team featured the MVP runner-up, the top 2 Cy Young vote getters, and the Rookie of the Year. And just look how incredible this lineup was. And consider that Zach Greinke was the 3rd starter in the rotation. And in that World Series, the Nationals would go down 3-2 in the series before winning Games 6 and 7 on the road, which included another comeback from a 2-run deficit late into Game 7. So in this run, they won 5 straight elimination games, which included late game comebacks in almost every one, and defeated 2 teams that set franchise records for wins. And with all the social media narrative, this run is similar to the 2011 Dallas Mavericks in that it defines a legit hard-earned title that became even more respected with the news that came out in the offseason. So, in the end, no matter if a team's run was as difficult on paper as the 2019 Nationals or as easy as the 1984 Tigers, they all ultimately count the same. And teams will always have the possibility to make their run easier by performing well in the regular season. But before we go, let's look at what the hardest possible run in this year's playoffs will be. Although the playoffs have already started, as you may expect, the toughest road to a championship in terms of opponent wins does come from the 6th seed Arizona Diamondbacks. This is assuming they play the Braves in the NLCS and Orioles in the World Series. The total would equal 397 wins. And actually, in the AL, the toughest spot is the 5th seed Rangers, whose opponents will total 393 if they play the Astros in the ALCS and the Braves in the World Series. Then for the wins above average, both the Marlins and Rangers would tie if they went on these exact routes. And when we add these stats up, the Rangers would have the hardest run with this exact route that would end up edging the 2019 Nationals, assuming this all falls into place. And the Rangers go at least 1 for 2 when attempting to get the final out of the World Series this time.